Okay, so here we have our DS610 servos, the rubbers that need to go onto the lugs, the mounting screws for our servo horns and the horns themselves. And basically we just need to mount these servos up with the horns and rubbers and Loctite the screws on them, and they can be bolted into the frames. But what I shall probably do is bolt these into the frames first and then fit the horns afterwards. Okay, so in order to mount the servos we need these carbon tabs which effectively go on there like that, one on the other side, and then we need the 4 self-tapping screws which go through and bolt it into the frames. Incidentally, I didn't mention it, but these rubbers come with a brass insert and you don't use them because these screws won't go through if you put the brass inserts in there. So I'll go ahead and bolt these into the frames and we can have a look at how they're orientated once they're in. Okay, so here's our first servo mounted up. Notice that the shaft is towards the motor. That's the only thing you need to know about this particular servo, and that's now bolted securely in place. For our other 2 servos, we've actually got mounting brackets that they go into. So if I just bring those into shot here, see those here, these mounting brackets. And the servos effectively go inside these brackets, so I'll just stick this one in just to show. Get through there. Right, so that effectively sits into the bracket like that, and then we bolt this into that bracket, and then we bolt the bracket into the frames. And the same with the other one here, so wire goes through. So, and then that gets bolted into that bracket, and then we can install that into the frames again. So I'll mount these up and then we can have a look at how they have gone into the frames. Okay, so I've got the servos, the cyclic servos at least, mounted now. There are 2 up the front which are bolted directly into the frames and don't use the trays that I showed you earlier. So these ones just bolt straight in, shafts towards the main shaft. The one at the top here, that is in the deepest of the 2 trays, so you can see it there, mounted with the shaft of the servo towards the top. So you can see the shaft here towards the top. That bolts in there. Now you'll notice that my motor has come out here. I've actually taken this out, and the reason for that is you can't actually get this servo in whilst the motor is actually mounted in here, so I had to uninstall the motor, install the servo, and now I'll have to put the motor back in again. Now the last tray which I showed you, this one here, this is actually the tail servo tray and mounts in the back of the frames, which I'm going to do in a moment. Okay, so we're just peering into the back of the frames here, and you can see the tail servo mounted and the shaft towards the rear of the model, bolted in place. On the outside here is the 4 screws, and that's pretty much the servo installation completed. We've now got to put the servo horns on here and Loctite the horns in place, and I've also got to put the various, there's a whole bunch of balls which you can see here which need to go onto those horns. So I'm now going to go through and mount up the balls onto the various horns in the correct places, and I'll show you that, and then we can install those onto the servos. And then once that's done, I'll then put my motor back into the gap at the top here in the frames where I've taken it out, and that's the servos and the motor then all done, and the servo horns all in place. Okay, so here we have the servo horns. I've made these up all the same. You can see, let's try and bring this up a bit closer to the camera. There you go, you can see how I've mounted that up, and the balls are on the other side, and that's the same for all 3 of them. Balls are on the inside of the horn, and we can now mount those to the machine. Okay, so there's the motor back in. It runs quite close to this servo cage, but not close enough to touch. You can see the horn mounted here. At this point I've just put the screw in here. I haven't Loctited it because until we get the bell cranks on here and start lining things up, we don't really know where we want to mount this servo horn, so we may end up sort of twisting it around to get a better position for it for our centres. And if we look at the other side of the machine, we can see here again mounted up horn, another mounted horn in here. All the balls are to the inside. You can see ball here to the inside and the balls down in there to the inside, and the same on this outer servo here. So they're all in place. Obviously we still have to adjust those horns for the correct position on the servo spline. So the last one to do is the one at the rear, and it's just a plastic horn we need to put on this for our tail servo drive. So I need to pick an appropriate horn and mount that up there, which is what I'll be doing next. Okay, so here's my servo horn for the tail servo. I've gone for the largest kind of star horn that is available with the servo to give me the biggest range of adjustment, because I don't know quite where I'm going to want to put the ball for the flyby system at this particular point. But at the moment I've gone 2 holes out for the ball. I think that'll be around about right, and that's mounting the ball on the inside as well towards the servo spline, as you can see. And I'm going to fit that to the machine now. Okay, here's my tail servo horn. I've gone 3 holes out for mounting the ball. It's mounted on the inside as well, the ball, and I've noticed that this ball does foul the top of the servo as well when you bolt this in place. But it's only at an extreme of movement, so I'm hoping that when I set up the tail it's not going to move so far as this then hits the top of the servo case, but we'll see when that's mounted in. If that is the case, then I may have to put a little washer down inside the horn here just to space it away from the servo very slightly, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Okay, this is an addendum to the build, because one of the things I wanted to highlight is that throughout the rest of this build you're going to notice that the bell cranks here, pointing with a pair of scissors, whatever came to hand, the bell cranks here will actually be mounted the wrong way around. And the reason for this is that when I did the build of the bell cranks, I assumed that the factory would have actually installed these correctly the right way around and built them accordingly. Now, because they're a very odd shape, it's difficult to see from the manual which way around they should be mounted, and you'll know if you've got it wrong because when you come to set up your collective pitch, and this is the experience I had, if you've got them the wrong way around you'll find that your swash plate sits really low down the shaft here, and you really just can't get the right pitch range at all. And the reason for that is that these arms need to come off, need to be flipped around and put back on again. And the way they should go is that you'll notice that they're a kind of a triangular shape, and there is a really long edge, and that really long edge you should be able to make it horizontal. So I'm just turning it here, horizontal to the main gear. So it should be at the bottom. The longest edge should be at the bottom, and you should be able to make it horizontal to the main gear. And if you can do that, then you know you've got the bell crank on the right way. If you've got it on the wrong way, you have to turn it off, flip it over and put it back on again, but also you have to swap the balls over from one side of the bell crank to the other. So throughout the rest of this build you'll notice that they are in fact on the wrong way round. My apologies for that. I'm filming this little video segment just to make you aware of that, so that you can basically ignore the orientation of these throughout the rest of the build and get them on the right way first time around for your build. So I'll insert this video segment at the appropriate place in the build video so that you can get it right for the rest of the build, and then just ignore the fact that they're wrong on mine as you go through the rest of the build. Okay, so our next step is the shared ccpm control shaft, which has got our bell cranks on it and our A-arm for the elevator. That's the next thing we're going to be mounting into the machine. Before we do that, we've got to fit this up with all the various balls. So the control bell cranks, this inner elevator bell crank, all need to be installed with the various balls for the control system, and we're also going to have to make up the rods for connecting this stuff all up to our cyclic servos. So next step for me is to put all the balls onto here, so I'll do that and then you can have a look and see what that looks like. Okay, so here we have the shared ccpm control shaft, and what I want you to note is the position of the balls. So on these outer bell cranks, the balls are on the outside. So if I just tip this up, you can see balls on the outside. And then for the flyballast system, this ball here goes on the inner hull, not the outer one. And the same the other side, on the inside and on the outside for the other balls. Now all the balls on these outer bell cranks are the shorter ones. You'll notice on the elevator A-arm we've got these longer balls, and these basically face out towards the bell crank, away from the A-arm itself. So these are pointing away from the A-arm itself. Then on the top here we've mounted the ball link with the screw, put some Loctite on this and Loctite on all the other balls as well to hold them in place. Take these screws out either side, put some Loctite on those to do those up. And once you've done all of that, you're then in a position to basically take the screws out at the end here, take this apart and install the A-arm and the shared ccpm control shaft into the machine, and then the bell cranks on the outside. Now there are some washers and spacers provided which allow you to get the correct spacing for this on the shaft. Here's a couple of them here. Let's put that down there. And those are to make sure you don't have any side play in the shaft when you install it into the machine. So I'm going to go ahead and put this into the machine, and then I'll show you what that looks like when it's done. Okay, so there we can see the bell crank mounted to the shaft there, and the A-arm is in the top of the frames here. So I'll just bring this in a little closer. And you can see there's the A-arm. This isn't secured yet. If I turn this around, let's bring the camera down slightly. We can see the A-arm itself is currently can slide backwards and forwards on the ccpm shaft because we haven't done up that grub screw in the middle there. But you can see how it all fits together. One bell crank one side, one the other. I had to use one of the brass washers and a single silver washer on the inside here just to space the shaft appropriately so that there's no end play in it. And also don't forget to put the little washers underneath the screws here, otherwise the bell crank isn't going to be held on correctly, so you want a washer under the button head screw there. Okay, so that's the ccpm shaft installed. We've now got to make up some rods to connect the rods between all of the cyclic servos and these bell cranks. And once we've done that, we can move on to the next part of the build, which is actually the tail system. Okay, just a quick update. Something I forgot to mention is when you're assembling the elevator A-arm, you must make sure that for the flyballast system, the screw here is in the hole that is furthest down the A-arm, not in the outer hole, which you can just sort of see the edge of here. This outer hole is how it comes pre-installed, so you do have to change it. You have to move the little washers down and then put the screws in further down the shaft. There are two holes here effectively, and you need to use the inner one for flyballast. Okay, so with that done, we can talk about the push rods. So here we have the push rods. These are the ones that go on the elevator, and these are the long ones that go from our front servos up to our shared ccpm shaft bell cranks. The gap in the middle here is 2mm, and on these ones 97.5mm between the edge of each plastic ball link. So those can be installed onto the machine, so I'll just go and do that. Okay, so here we have the linkage rod installed, or linkage rods installed for the cyclic at the front. I had to shorten these a little tiny bit based on what the manual said, but not very much. If we look at the other side of the model, same the other side, linkage rods. And then for the one in here, the elevator, make sure that you've got your A-arm here up out the top of the machine before you put the rods on. And what I found it was easiest to do was to actually take this servo horn out, put the rods onto it, and then push it back in and clip it onto the rods, which you can see. It's quite difficult to see, but you can see down inside there. Try and point at them here and further down here is where we've clipped on. And those rods, again, I had to shorten those a little bit as well in order to get them to pop on nicely. Obviously we haven't centered the servos up yet or done any of that, that's for later. So that's the control rods in place, and in terms of building up our frames, that's where we stopped now, and the next thing for us to do is to start putting together the tail system.